Hey, what's up, tribe? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the TFC audio project Down Under. This episode is all about stress. We talk through the physiology of the stress response, the effect of chronic stress on health, how our beliefs and perceptions influence this, and of course, some simple practices you can integrate into your life to improve your relationship with stress.
This week's episode is brought to you by TFC Wild Toes. I'm probably preaching to the converted, but footwear as it exists today is a pretty big problem. Most shoes are narrow and rigid, squishing your toes. The longer you spend in them, the more your feet start to adopt that shape, and before you know it, you have bunions that are getting out of control. Natural, healthy human feet have toes that spread apart and don't touch each other. We call them wild toes. Our toe spreaders fit all foot sizes and can help realign toes, stretch intrinsic foot muscles, improve balance, relieve foot pain and tension, improve posture and alignment, and increase foot mobility. And we're stoked to say we are now donating $5 from every order of a TFC original product, like our wild toes, to Reforest Now to plant one tree. We're hoping to plant 1,000 by the end of the year. You can check out our website, tfc-shopaus.com, to find out more about that mission and to get yourself a pair of wild toes.
All right, you're back with James and Mac, and this episode is going to be all about stress. So we've touched on stress in a few episodes about just the effect of chronic stress on your health and the importance of managing stress as an overall part of health and well-being.
It's played into probably a lot of podcasts we've done, really. There's been an element of stress to a lot of the impacts on health that we've talked about.
Yeah, exactly. And so we just figured it deserved a full episode for itself. And it is actually quite a deep, very deep and nuanced topic that could probably have an entire podcast series devoted to it, actually. But for this episode, we'll just keep it fairly general and practical so that, you get a good understanding of what the stress response is and how it works and how it affects your health, and then mostly some practices that you can do to try and avoid the negative effects of stress, because you can't always avoid all stress, obviously.
Of course not. If only.
If only. Well, we'll get into that. So all of that being said, I think it is helpful to start with just a bit of depth in terms of the physiology of the stress response and, where that comes from in terms of an evolutionary context, because, we always try to start with that evolutionary context, because I think the more we understand about the history and the mechanisms, or why the mechanisms are there, the better chance we have of making it work for us.
Because stress isn't a new thing.
No, it's not a new thing. No, it's like as old as it comes, basically, as old as life, really. So stress does get quite a bad rap in today's society, and even we've given it a bit of a bad rap, and this is why we wanted to delve into it more. But at its core, really, stress is just simply the body's response to challenges or perceived threats in the environment, which is really just a fundamental survival mechanism, because our body has this state, or tries to maintain a state of homeostasis, as it's known, or also known as allostasis, and that is essentially equilibrium or balance, a dynamic balance where you're surviving, obviously, and then if something in the environment or internally tries to throw you out of that homeostatic balance, then you need a response in order to change that. And so, easy example is the sun is really hot that day and you sweat, you need a response to maintain balance. And so if we just talk through the physiology of the stress response, we won't go into extreme depth, but I think it's helpful to understand a little bit of depth. So the brain perceives some kind of danger or threat in the environment, some kind of challenge, and a classic example here is like a saber-toothed tiger, and so
always go the saber-toothed tiger.
Always. Or, a tree falling down or something like that, where you go, whoa, I'm in danger here, I need to do something. And
you gotta react.
Yeah. Mind you, most of this, or all of this stress response is subconscious, so it's not actually you thinking about it and getting stressed. It's happening like that often before you even recognize what's happening. So you perceive some kind of threat, your brain then, the cortex or whatever the stimulus is, whether it's vision or hearing or some combination of all the above, and basically you get a signal to the amygdala, which is a part of the brain that's known as the fear center of the brain, but it also contributes to different aspects of emotional processing. And then the amygdala sends a signal to the hypothalamus, which is a part of the brain. It's kind of like a command center, but it acts as a link between your nervous system and your endocrine system. And your endocrine system is essentially your hormonal system. So the hypothalamus is the controller of all of these hormones, essentially. And what happens is the hypothalamus then sends a signal to the adrenals, which then release epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline. And then that floods the body and promotes that classic fight or flight response that we all hear about, where you get an increased heart rate and blood flow to your large muscles. You get an increased breathing rate, so you're trying to get more oxygen in, and especially to the muscles and to the brain. You get a big release of glucose and fats into the bloodstream to supply the energy to those muscles. So all of these things that are promoting movement, really, because it's fight or flight.
Yeah.
There is another option, which is freeze. But in, the classic fight or flight response is, okay, there's a saber-toothed tiger, I need to run in the opposite direction, or I need to get ready to fight for my life. Or there's a tree falling down, I'm about to get hit, I need to get out of there quickly. And so often, that stress response happens even before you consciously register what happens or what is about to happen. You get that flood of that stress cascade happens often before you consciously register it.
Sure.
Which is quite interesting. You also get improved sight and hearing and other senses, and improved immune function. So not only ability to fight against predators or other tribes or other humans, but increased ability to fight against infections. Because often what would happen in nature, if you are under that stress response, something's trying to attack you. And when your skin gets split by saber teeth or sabers, you're at risk of infection. So you need that increased immune function to fight that off.
Interesting, yeah.
And so the other option is freeze. And I was reading a little bit of Nicole LePeraHow's book, How to Do the Work. She's this holistic psychologist, which she has a really great Instagram page with a whole heap of good content that around trauma and stress and depression and anxiety and all of these things. So I highly recommend checking her out. But we've just got a new book. I haven't finished it, or I haven't barely even started it really, but I was just flicking through to some relevant areas when it comes to stress, and she's talking about the freeze response as well. And she was saying how evolutionarily that might have actually come from the fact that say you see a bear 20 meters away and your fight or flight response comes in. You can't fight a bear really, so you're out of there. You're flying.
Yeah.
You're running away at top speed. But if the bear's already upon you and you can't fight it because it's a bear, you can probably try, I guess. You can't run because it's already got you in its jaws. Then that freeze response is just playing dead, basically, just acting dead so that you can maybe the bear will let you go or not eat you or something.
Is that what we see? It's not as scary as bear. I mean, for some people it may be as scary as a bear, but I mean, people who freeze up in social circumstances, whether it's public speaking or, I guess there's obviously a stress response going on there. And when people freeze up and they get stage fright, in inverted commas, is that the freeze state, or
essentially
is that the flee state, I guess, the flight state?
Yeah, a bit of both.
Yeah.
But it is a stress response, and that's where it gets quite interesting, is because this stress response really evolved under more of those physical conditions where it's some kind of predator or rival species or rival within your species trying to attack you, and you need to defend, and it's that physical danger or threat. But the stress response is generic, and so if you have psychological stress or psychological threat in some sense, and social status is a very big thing for humans because poor social status really is very, very linked to death, especially ancestrally. And so people's social status really matters to them, and that's why public speaking is such a ubiquitous fear among so many people, is because the risk of putting yourself out there in that vulnerable situation, making a fool of yourself, or people thinking worse of you for whatever reason. And that is enough. That psychological threat is enough to activate a stress response, and your brain doesn't differentiate between a physical threat or a psychological threat or emotional threat or anything. It's the same generic stress response to any of it.
And I'm sure we'll probably dive deeper into it later in the podcast, but I'm guessing these threats can take many different forms for many different people. I guess it all depends on, while we don't have bears and saber-toothed tigers threatening us in our environment anymore, the threats, and the dangers aren't necessarily physical, but I'm sure, everybody has their own different types of stresses that can promote these sort of responses. Yeah, exactly. And this is where it's interesting. So what I didn't mention is that the bear or the saber-toothed tiger isn't the stress. So that environmental factor isn't the stress. That is the stressor. Yeah.
And the stress is the body's response to the stressor.
Right.
And depending on, and we will get into this later as well, but depending on how you perceive a stressor will influence how much that stress response is activated or for how long. And so some people might view something as a stressor, and other people would be like, that's not stressful at all to me.
Down to perception, of course.
Yeah. So, and that's a really interesting concept that does line up with everything else that we talk about as well. But so you get this stress cascade, and you get adrenaline pumping through your veins, and you get all of these short-term benefits actually. So that stress is actually quite good for you in the short term and in the right context. A lot of that comes down to, like we say, your perception, and most importantly about your perception is whether you feel this stressful event is within your capabilities. And this is what they term eustress, E-U-S-T-R, EU stress. And it's actually, really good for immune function, good for cognition, good for memory, good for, I guess, promoting movement and it's quite health promoting. Whereas distress, which it can be short term, but tends to be a bit longer term and is perceived to be outside of your capabilities, is pretty much the opposite. It reduces immune function, it reduces cognition, and obviously feels pretty terrible. And so that difference between eustress and distress, I think, is important, because if people just think stress is bad for you and I shouldn't be stressed, then they avoid anything that's stressful, but that's actually avoiding growth. And that eustress, that good stress, is what really promotes growth. So we are really made to adapt to stress as well. And so again, it's all about context and perception and duration. So if the stressful event continues, we talked about how the hypothalamus activates the adrenal glands, and then once that rush of adrenaline goes down, if there's a continuing presence of the stressor, then the hypothalamus can then activate what's called the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. Again, it's kind of not super relevant. Well, it's relevant, but we don't have to go so deep into the weeds. But the essence of that is then cortisol can get involved, and cortisol is that another stress hormone that people are quite familiar with and that people view as bad. But again, cortisol is just a good hormone in the right context and in the right balance. You just don't want you don't want any hormone to be constantly pumping. You need that equilibrium or dynamic equilibrium between states of stress and states of relaxation. So I guess that activation of cortisol, if that's chronically activated, that's where we especially see those, the decrease in immune function and some of those more negative effects. And people might be aware of this, but cortisol or corticosteroids are used as immunosuppressants in medicine. And so, we produce certain immunosuppressants. And I think it's more, actually, from reading up more, it's more to do with changing the focus of the immune system from, there's two different aspects of the immune system. We should probably do a whole podcast on immunity as well. But either way, long-term cortisol is not your friend.
Gotcha.
or long-term elevated above normal levels of cortisol. Yeah. So, that's what we were saying before. It's I like to get into a little bit of that physiology, because just to give that really deep appreciation for what the body does under the hood. Like, it has all these survival mechanisms and really quite complex processes that help us survive under certain conditions. And we need to recognize that those processes are built to be our friend. They're not our enemy.
Yeah.
But we need to figure out how to work with it, basically.
Yeah, for sure. And I think when you understand that chain reaction a little bit clearer, it probably can help you remove yourself from that stress situation and take a more bird's eye view of, okay, what's actually going on? Why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? And what's actually, like you said, going on under the hood, rather than just reacting and stressing and then stressing and stressing some more and it all piling on. It probably could be a good technique to just try and remove yourself from the situation.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because we need right now, like ancestrally, if we look at that evolutionary context, we'd have a stressor, and once we'd either escape from the saber-toothed tiger or we'd die. If we escaped, then from there, the natural response is, okay, cool, now it's parasympathetic activity, which is rest and digest. So sympathetic is the stress response, which is fight, flight, or freeze. And parasympathetic is, cool, now it's time to recover. It's time to shuttle those nutrients back to the cells. It's time to lower the heart rate, lower the breathing rate, and just, hopefully eat some food and just recover from that stressful event. And so the problem is now we have a lot of exposure to stress in our modern environment and in our modern lifestyles, a lot of psychological stresses, and the physical stresses, interestingly, more come from a lack of exposure to vigorous movement and sleep and all of these things, and lack of quality food. And so all of these, we need the tools, because all of these psychological and physiological stresses of a mismatched environment and lifestyle mean that we can't, the general population, or modern humans in general, don't have that ability to drop back into the parasympathetic rest and digest. Because, there's a lot of studies, like we've talked about, around, when we, in the habitat and tribe episodes, where the disconnection from nature is very bad for us and reconnection with nature is very good for us. And a lot of that is to do with lowering cortisol and lowering the stress response, or at least balancing out that stress response is that connection to nature. And then connection with community also does the same thing. And so if we don't have those, which a lot of people don't in the modern environment or modern context, then we're constantly stressed by all of these things that are making us stressed, but we're not recovering.
So it's not that the body or the brain can't access that parasympathetic response, but it's just that we don't have the tools, I guess, to reach that space, because we don't have the support. We're living in environments that we shouldn't be living in, or habitats that aren't built to promote that.
Yeah, and we're not given a basic operating manual of, this is how you can tap into your autonomic nervous system. And because that is scientifically backed now, that we do have certain levels of control over our autonomic nervous system, which we will talk about, and we have talked about in the breathing podcast as well, that I had a chat with Tom about. And we're disconnected from nature. We're disconnected generally from community, or we're only connected digitally, or mostly connected digitally. And we've got a mismatch in terms of what we should be eating and how we should be sleeping and how much movement and variability of movement we should be doing. And we're not given those tools, and we're not given even the awareness of how that affects us.
Is it the sort of thing that, like a muscle in the body, that you have to work on to build up the ability to do this, or is it something that once you recognise that you can just switch it on and off?
I think it would probably be more like a muscle. I think different people will have different propensities to that. So I do believe that there's a certain, you can have a light bulb moment, or there's a certain realization or epiphany that you can have that acts like a light switch, where things that used to stress you out just don't anymore. And I know I've experienced that myself through, reading different books and different podcasts and experiences where I go, wow, I never thought about it like that. Oh, geez, that makes so much sense. And then I've had a realization, suddenly a certain situation doesn't stress me out anymore because I know how I can...
Well, I know it was the same with me after reading Eckhart Tolle's Power of Now. And I guess
that was what I was thinking of as well.
Yeah. And I guess that's sort of why I asked, because, while... And I was one of those people who was living in... I've lived in habitats or environments that haven't really been good for my health, and then worked in environments where they probably haven't been good for my health as well, or good for stress. I guess I just sort of wondered whether it was that simple to read a book, or to have someone explain it to you through a podcast like this, and to then be able to go, oh. Because for me, it did feel quite sudden. That transition. It's not that I don't get stressed anymore, but I think it's quite interesting to note just how powerful that psychological impact can be on just cutting it out. Like, while all the you can change all of the physical things, you can remove yourself from this, that, and the other, but until it's actually explained or succinctly communicated to you how to take control of that, or how to view it differently. I do wonder what's more powerful, whether the physical changes or the mental changes can.
Well, yeah, it is an interesting one. I guess what's more or even most interesting about that whole concept is that the separation between physical and mental is illusory. It's all the same. Fair. So when you do change that mental perception, or you have a change in belief or attitude about something, then that does create physiological changes in your body. And then if you create physiological changes through movement or sleep or exposing yourself to nature, then that can change your attitudes and beliefs and everything as well. And when it comes to the power of now, I was going to talk a bit about this more later, but seeing as we brought it up, it does quite relate to everything we've talked about just then as well, in terms of that fact that we can have psychological stress through we can have that stress through an anticipated event, right? So worrying about the future, where we go, oh my God, I've got this, say I've got a speech in a week, and you spend a week worrying about it and going through all these worst case scenarios in your head about what could happen if you didn't get it right, or all of these things, whereas that threat isn't in your immediate environment, and yet your mind
is... The saber-toothed tiger isn't there in front of you right now about to jump on you,
but your brain is still undergoing that stress response, and that's something in the future. Or you could have some kind of event in the past where someone did you wrong, or some kind of trauma, and you ruminate on that event in the past and stimulate that stress response over and over again, but it's already happened.
The saber-tooth attack.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like someone going, "Oh, geez, why did that saber-toothed tiger want to eat me? Like, I'm really, I'm so, as opposed to go, cool, I survived the tiger. Now I can move on with my life."
Yeah.
And that's Eckhart, I highly recommend reading The Power of Now. He explains it all a lot better than I just have. But the essence is, if you live in the present moment, which is also the essence of mindfulness and meditation, essentially. Essentially. But if you live in the present moment and you're not worrying about the future or ruminating on the past, then you're far less likely to be stressed, especially if there isn't an immediate danger. And if there is an immediate threat or situation that needs to be dealt with, you'll deal with it the best if you're living in the moment and not distracted by future or past.
Yeah, absolutely. Because like you said, those those hormones that are created, and the physiological inner workings that are going on when that's happening in that moment. The body is creating that response to deal with that threat currently, right now. And so I suppose it getting itself all worked up and producing all of these chemicals in the body for something that it can't tackle now or has already tackled. What good what good is that purpose?
Yeah, it's not going to do you much good. And that's I feel that plus all of the things we've just talked about tends to keep people in, chronically activating their stress response without the ability to recover from it properly, and without that ability to drop back into parasympathetic when they need to or when they want to. And so we can think about stress working on a bit of a U-curve. So it's great for you up until a point. And then once you get to the tip of the U-curve, or it's an inverted U-curve really, so you get to the tip of the U-curve, and then there's a tipping point where that stress, whether it's the amount of stress or the duration, that is no longer good for you. And it starts to take a toll on your health, like we've talked about in terms of immune function, and contributes to a lot of chronic diseases as well. So pretty much all of the major chronic lifestyle diseases, heart disease and stroke and cancer and Alzheimer's and depression, are all contributed to by chronic stress. And we need to be aware of the signs that you're getting chronically stressed. And one of the biggest signs is you're having trouble having quality sleep. So you're having trouble getting to sleep or getting up in the morning. There's sleep trackers and stuff available now, but other things include a loss of pleasure or a loss of sense of humor and play, and your avoidance of new things, and
disconnecting from people.
Becoming more socially isolated, and that also is a stressor. Social isolation is a major stressor, like we've talked about in the last podcast on tribe. And so all of these are signs that you're chronically stressed. But an interesting thing about the link between chronic stress and disease and death is that a lot of it comes down to your beliefs around stress. And so that they actually play a major role in how negatively stress can affect your health. And so there's a TED Talk by Kelly McGonigal, who's also written a book called The Upside of Stress. And she references a study where they tracked 30,000 people over 8 years, and they asked them 2 questions. One was, how much stress have you been under? Essentially, like, what are your levels of stress? And then the other was, do you believe that stress is harmful for your health? And it turns out that people who were highly stressed or had, very big stressful life events in the previous year had a 43% increased risk of dying. But that was only true for people who were highly stressed and believed that stress was harmful for their health. And the people who were highly stressed and didn't believe stress was harmful for their health didn't have an increased risk of dying. In fact, maybe showed a slightly protective effect.
Wow.
And so this just goes to show about the concept of your perception of, yes, I'm stressed, but if I don't believe that's bad for me, then, or if you believe that it's somehow making you grow or you have a positive attitude to it, then it can actually very significantly change how it affects you.
I guess, awesome to hear that if I don't think stress is going to kill me, then I'll live forever. But on the flip side, I think, the real struggle that people get in these days is, like we've spoken about on the podcast multiple times, people do have this underlying belief that stress is bad for you, and it's bad for your health. And those examples you used before of I guess signs of chronic stress, a lot of those things sort of are perpetuative. Like they fuel the stressors, and then
like a negative cycle.
Yeah. And I guess that must be pretty difficult for people to break out of.
100%, yeah.
And it's hard to change that perception of stress being good for your health when I'm stressing and now I'm disconnecting from people, and I'm identifying that I'm stressing and I'm disconnecting from people, and so I'm stressing more, and
Yeah, exactly.
down the slope you go.
And so, yeah, as much as I think it's really cool to understand about how beliefs and perceptions influence health, and that's really right in line with The Biology of Belief, which is a book by Bruce Lipton, and he was the father of epigenetics, and he talks about how our beliefs create physiological changes in our body, which we've just discussed before. But at the same time, we do obviously need to recognize that, well, we just need to be aware and recognize when stresses actually need to be addressed or removed from our life. And so I guess this comes back to what we were saying about the power of now. Is it's not all about just going, oh, okay, the stress is good for me, or stress is normal, and so I'll just endure this. If you're in a abusive relationship, or a toxic workplace, or you've got these poor lifestyle habits that are all acting as distress, or negative stressors in your life, it's not always about accepting them. But if something can be changed, then you should change it, because sometimes removing the negative stressor, or removing the stressor, is the key thing you need to get out of that stressful pattern. And sometimes altering it in some way is the key thing. And if you can't remove or alter it, then acceptance is the only way.
It's interesting that that whole idea of your perception of the stress, because my job before I joined you, I sort of wore it as a badge of honor for the 7 years that I did it, that being a journalist is one of the most stressful jobs on the planet. And, it very often always ranks in the top few jobs of most stressful. And chefs are up there as well.
Oh, yeah.
And we've all got potty mouths, so I think that speaks for itself. But yeah, for the 7 years that I did that, or at least for the first 6 years that I did that, I was like a workhorse, slogging day in, day out, and knew that I was stressed, but I guess didn't understand for a lot of those years the negative health impacts that could have. And so possibly, and through those years, my health wasn't great, I don't think. My immune system was quite weak, and I would often get sick. And in the sort of year and a half, 2 years since I read Eckhart Tolle and The Power of Now, and sort of helped me change my perception on stress in general, and how to respond to certain situations, and just being more aware of the life I was living, removing myself from that constant stress, and now taking control of my stress and how I want that to impact my life. It hasn't, I've been the healthiest I've been for the last couple of years. I haven't really had maybe one common cold, touch wood. But it's interesting that for that first 6 years, while I guess I knew that stress wasn't great for you, but it's not like I was beating myself up every day thinking, oh, this stress is going to kill me. But it still was, or it must have been a contributing
affecting
factor.
You.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and
maybe I'm an outlier, but but I'm sure there were probably other elements to the job, that it wasn't just the stress. I mean, it was the hours and the, it all adds to it. It wasn't the stress alone that was probably bad for my health. But
yeah. And yeah, there would be so many factors. But I also remember, over the years and us talking, and you would always be very good at finding meaning and purpose, or creating that meaning and purpose in the stories that you would run. And obviously, if you look back on a whole, it's like, oh yes, you were reporting on crime and there was a lot of negative news and all of these things. But I would also remember you telling me about certain stories that made a big difference in people's lives, where you were able to crowdfund, money for people who had a house fire, or you were able to, there was certain meaning and purpose that you were able to attach to that role.
The ways I was able to spin it.
Yeah, you were spinning it for yourself. And that, I think, really comes back to what we're saying is, you had a career goal or a career vision of this is what I want to do.
Yeah.
And that was what you wanted to do at the time. And so finding that meaning and purpose allowed you to put up with a lot of stress that maybe you wouldn't have been able to put up with, or you wouldn't have been able to get through without, if you didn't have that purpose, or if you weren't really sure if you really wanted to be a journalist, or if you could deal with the stress. Whereas then you realize, actually, I'm not sure this is exactly what I want to do. I'm not feeling the purpose and meaning in this role anymore. And then that's when you realize that you couldn't keep going.
And that's what I was going to say. It was when that, light bulb went on, and I realized that this wasn't actually fulfilling my purpose. But I was still working 12-hour days and was still stressing for 11 and a half of those hours without a lunch break.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have the meaning behind what I was doing. That's when it really started to, I could really feel the impact of that stress.
Yeah.
And it was weighing on me a lot heavier than it had the whole 7 years. I wasn't working any harder than I ever worked, and I wasn't getting less sleep or any of these things, but I could feel that burden far stronger once I removed. Yeah, once the veil was lifted, I suppose.
Yeah, and I've found the same thing through different, my different roles as a physio in different contexts, where at first I'd be starting a new position or a job, and I'd be really excited, and I'd be like, sweet, I resonate completely with this business or with this message, and this is what I want to do, and so I would work, and a lot of it was on my own business, and so I'd do all this research and a lot of extra effort, but it wasn't, I guess, perceived so much as stressful because I had the why behind it. But then as your perceptions or I'll just talk about myself, as my understanding of different things evolved, and I didn't resonate as much with the way things were being done in that practice, then it would start to stress me out, and I would withdraw from the people in the workplace, and I would do less and less until it got to the point where I just realized I had to leave. And so there are certain times where you do need to remove yourself from that stress, and a lot of it has to do with your purpose or what meaning you find in what you're doing.
Yeah, and did that that TED Talk mention about the drivers behind meaning and the links between that and stress?
Yeah, and that was her last line, which we both were just really impressed with, because I can't remember the exact way she said it, but the idea is that you need to, we're never going to be able to get rid of stress, and really anything worth having or doing is going to involve some kind of stress, but we need to find activities that give us a sense of meaning, and then we can trust ourselves to put up with the stress that is involved with that.
Yeah.
She says it way better. That was long-winded, but you get the idea.
Yeah, and I mean, it's something that Eckhart says in A New Earth. He talks about how essentially you can't let... You can have stress, but then you can also... And I can't think of the word that he uses, but it's repurposing those stresses as, this isn't something that's dangerous or a threat to me or is going to beat me. This is actually the fire in my belly that's going to help drive me to do what I want to do. Mm-hmm. And yeah, again, it's perception, but it's taking control of that stress and turning it into a positive.
Exactly. Yeah. And Frank Forencich talks about that as well. And he talks about changing the story and changing the narrative, which we did that whole podcast on the power of story, and this narrative, rather than going, oh, this is so stressful, I'm so worried about this, I can really feel all of these things in my body happening, that I feel anxiety or whatever, and this is a common thread between what he says and what Kelly McGonigal says in that TED talk, and everything is just that if you change the narrative and go, oh, my heart beating faster, that's helping me get blood to my brain so I can focus better, and that feeling of even clamminess or like a bit jittery, that's like excitement rather than anxiety, or, just changing the story around what you're experiencing and really understanding that humans have adapted to be they've adapted to be able to deal with stress. Like we're very adaptive biological machines. We've got a long history of adapting to very challenging situations in our environment, and just acknowledging like, yes, I am I'm a human. Obviously it goes for other life forms as well, but I'm a human. My ancestors have dealt with stress. I can deal with this too. This is a challenge, not a threat. And changing that perception can make all the difference, especially if it means something to you. Obviously, if you're in certain situations that really you just shouldn't be in, like an abusive relationship or a toxic workplace, then often the best thing is to remove. But if you really know that deep down you want to be in this situation, you can handle the stress, and especially if you switch the narrative.
And I think that's something you identify pretty quickly, is that you can't really fool. You're in a belief system, you can try and tell yourself that, this stress isn't going to beat me, but if there isn't that meaning in what you're doing, you'll find out pretty quickly if you're lying to yourself. Yeah,
and it's like a gut feeling, a deep intuitive gut feeling, and that's sort of what I've always relied on when I start feeling those stress emotions, or those negative, that feeling of negative stress. You just get this like logically you might even for this reason, for security, or for financial security, or for prestige or whatever, then you want to stay in a certain role or a certain position, but you just get this gut feeling that it's not right. And every time I've followed that gut feeling, it's led to something better. Yeah. So
here we are.
Trust your gut. Exactly. Here we are. Exactly right. So that pretty much comes to the practices section. That's one of the main practices really, is switching the narrative and trying to change your perception of stress from a negative thing to a positive thing. And some things that can help with that are like a mindfulness practice, where you are tuning in and even just being aware when certain stress patterns are being activated, because a lot of this is just happening under the hood for people. They don't actually realize that is a stress response. They just feel bad, or they just feel worry or anxious or whatever, and a lot of it is to do with that physiological stress response. Another thing that is very helpful based on the research, and I've also found very helpful, is a gratitude practice. And this helps to, it's basically switching the narrative. It's a practice of learning to switch the narrative of finding things or looking for things that you're grateful for, rather than looking for things that you are unhappy about or stressed about. And we do have this, humans have a tendency to focus on negative stimuli, and I think we've discussed this before, but because negative stimuli or dangerous stimuli in the environment is more immediately a threat. It's more immediately related to survival, then our brain tends to focus on it. And so we can, especially, this is why news...
I was going to say, this is why the news is what it is.
Yeah, because
it
people
plays on that.
Like to watch, they subconsciously like to watch negative stuff because they feel they need to be aware of it. And even if it's not nowhere near their immediate environment, even things overseas, it's like, I need to know what kind of threats are coming overseas. And in essence, it's kind of like a preparatory thing. And sometimes that's practical, and a lot of times it's not
impractical.
But we tend to focus on the negative stimuli because that's how we're hardwired. But you can, as a practice, you can focus on things that you're grateful for. And over time, if you practice this, like in journaling, they say every day you write down 3 things you're grateful for, then you just start to notice that your brain is being trained And then you go, oh, I'm really grateful for that thing. And
I've noticed
out of the blue.
I've noticed you actually verbalizing it, like actually, vocalizing.
God, I'm so grateful that I have my eyesight. Also, like just random things. And I've always found, especially if I've had some kind of injury, or like I remember I had this debilitating back pain once after I was doing a bit of a funky move, and I'd been, funnily enough, I was quite stressed as well at the time. But anyway, I had this debilitating back pain, and I just remember at the time, that was about the time when I was starting a consistent gratitude practice, and I was just focusing on, geez, I'm really grateful I've got my eyesight, or I'm really grateful I've got my hearing, or you just find things that you are grateful for. And you can even, the best thing I think to do is switch the narrative and go, I'm grateful for this back pain, because I'm learning something about the capacity of my body, or I get a chance to rest, or I don't know. You just find ways to spin it. Where I'm grateful that, or if you've got a really annoying problem, and you go, geez, I'm really grateful for this problem because it's showing me that this is the worst of my problems, or whatever. However you want to spin it.
Yeah, I mean, prime example was when we were down in Sydney for the workshop tour recently, and I think, me a few years ago probably would have reacted differently to that situation. We'd had this big trip planned. We'd had 2 workshops we completed in Sydney on the Saturday, and we're meant to be heading off to Melbourne the next day for the second leg of our tour. And we had big plans in Melbourne, a workshop, a move and play session. We were going to go for a big hike with all the foot nerds. We just
A couple of podcasts,
had a full week booked, and we'd been looking forward to this for ages. And then COVID happened, and Brisbane was locked down. And because we'd been in the city within the time span, it meant that the responsible thing to do was to come home, and
we had to lock down.
We had to self-isolate,
get a COVID test.
It was a whole rigmarole, and the plans were completely turned upside down. And not once did I feel angry or upset or sort of frustrated. It was inconvenient, sure, but it was one of those things that my reaction to that, I stood back and sort of observed my own reaction to that situation, and I was quite happy with myself with how I'd handled it, because I think, me maybe 3-4 years ago would have been furious at the world. And, how could it do this when we've had this plan for so long? And rah, rah, rah.
Yeah, exactly. And it is one of those things that as soon as you realize you don't have control, it's just being imposed upon you.
Yeah.
You just go, well, that's it. Now let's figure out what the path ahead is. And we figured out what the steps were. We got an apartment. Fortunately, your uncle had that apartment free, which is great. We set up a Hackmanton court, and we, ordered some food in and had a really nice night. And then the next day drove back up to Brisbane, processed all the refunds, and figured out a new date. And not once were we like, oh God, bloody COVID.
Yeah.
Because if anything, we were like, oh, cool. All right, well, this will be interesting to see how this works out. Oh, we get to be home for the Easter weekend with our families. Oh, we get to do this or that.
And I think as well, it's probably important to note that we haven't been conditioned like most people who've lived through this pandemic with curveball after curveball and, cancellation after cancellation. Yeah. Ours was escaped a pretty relatively unscathed.
Easy situation.
Yeah, like that was probably one of the first real impacts that we've had in a long time from this whole event.
A pretty minimal impact. So full recognition of people whose businesses have actually been completely ruined by COVID, because it's pretty terrible.
It's terrible.
But it is,
and again, we can't speak from that perspective of trying to turn that negative into a positive. But
there's endless stories of people going through terrible situations, whether it's business or personal health or trauma, and they have found ways to turn that exact perceived negative situation into the biggest positive situation of their life. And I know that I've found that personally with injury and with clients, with physio clients with injuries, that at first they seem like this negative, frustrating, inconvenient, just a real pain in the ass. And then as you work through it and as you rehab and as you learn more about your body, it actually becomes the best thing that could have happened to you. And my own personal injuries and chronic pain in my knees helped me become a much better physio and be more empathetic with my clients, and taught me a whole heap about my body, and my knees have actually never felt stronger, including before the injuries. And so, yeah, it's finding a way to be grateful for whatever negative situation you're in, and understand the lessons that situation is trying to teach you, and then grow from it.
And it may not happen in that moment either.
No. Yeah.
It might be down the track. But yeah, and that's why it's important to reflect.
But it's the only way, really, because the only other option is that you're a victim to your circumstances and you get really caught up in it all and you just hate life. And
they're everywhere. People like this are everywhere. And it is a vicious cycle, and it's
not good for your health, and it's not good for the people around you. It's not good for your relationships.
No.
It's just, it's a tough one to break, but you just have to break it. If you take a third person look at yourself and go, geez, I complain a lot about little things, or I get really angry over little things, or XYZ, you just need to take a good hard look and go, well, do I want to be doing that, or is there a different way I can spin this, or spin this situation or situations in general to be more grateful, or to be more accepting, or to be more positive about it. And yeah, I hate that it kind of sounds like, just think better, just think positively. But it is pretty much the essence of it.
And again, I think it's, and I don't mean to drag my brother into this, but my brother Harrison, Harry we've always said he was a massive warrior and a massive stressor. It was like my mum. All throughout high school and all throughout university, stressed. And all throughout high school and all throughout university, all we ever said to him was, man, just stop stressing. Like, just chill out. And it wasn't until he finished the degree, and only in the last sort of 12 months has he gone on his own sort of journey of self-awareness. We could have told him a million times to stop stressing, but it wasn't until he took control of that, identified for himself what the disconnect was and what he needed to fix, and then changed the narrative himself that he made any real progress towards overcoming that. And it's a long road, and it's not like it's done once you realize that my perception of this whole thing all along has just been wrong. It doesn't change just like that, but it's maybe listen to people when they're telling you to chill out, but I can understand why that doesn't help.
Yeah. It doesn't tend to help if someone's telling you not to worry. Apparently, I think, what was I listening to? Apparently it actually increases the stress response.
Yeah, of course.
A lot of it has to, come down to you, really being ready to make that change. And also in the context with Harry, actually, is that I remember mid last year or whenever it was, we were having chats because Harry's just graduated physio, but he was in the process of his final year of physio, and a lot of the stress was coming from, I don't know if this is my purpose. I don't know if I have meaning behind this degree, and have I just spent 4 years studying something that I don't actually want to do? I want to be more creative, or what, he had these worries and I had similar worries because I got to the end of my degree and was pretty disenfranchised with it all as well. And so
it's that voice it's that gut feeling you're talking about.
Yeah. And so just talking through with him those and listening to him and having that ability to, I suppose, to empathize with that feeling because I'd been there as well. And then talking him through the different options based on my own experience and not telling him what to do, but listening to him and giving my own experience helped him figure out what path he needed to go down. And that has actually transcended into he's now in the best place that I've ever seen him or known him. And he's got a vision and got meaning and purpose behind it. And lo and behold, he's stressing a lot less about it all.
Yeah.
And so I guess that comes to the next tool or next practice that we're talking about is human connection. So the human connection is really the ultimate tool for stress resilience. And Kelly McGonigal talks about this in her TED talk as well. And the idea is that, if you're feeling stressed and you do open up to someone and be vulnerable and give them the chance to listen and help in whatever way they can, then that actually mitigates that stress response, or it helps you grow from that stress response. And she also references a study where I can't remember exactly, I think it was 1,000 people that they studied, and they asked, how stressed have they been in the last year, and how much time do they spend helping or caring for family members, friends, and people in their community. And they found that people who were highly stressed and had big stressful life events in the last year were 30% more likely to die. And the people who said they were highly stressed but also spent a lot of time helping and caring for friends, family, and community didn't have that higher likelihood of death. And so whether it's sharing stress or just feeling the stress but having that presence of support and human connection can make all the difference to how negatively stress affects you and whether it overwhelms you or whether you can grow from it.
Yeah, of course.
So that's a really good example. I hope he doesn't mind us talking about him on the potty.
Too late.
Love you, Haz. And so those are ways, I guess, other ways to mitigate the stress response, or to have that stress response, or to even just have more control over the stress response. There are some more physiological ways. So we've talked before about diaphragmatic breathing and nasal breathing as a way to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, so that rest and digest. And especially if you combine that with timing, so like say 6 seconds in or 6 seconds out, and also especially exhale emphasized breathing, where you're exhaling for longer and for like more intensely than you are inhaling. So like a sigh, basically. But you can time it with a timer, or there's different apps that you can get now. We use one called the Breathing app. And this is related to activation of the vagus nerve, which is one of the facial nerves, which is involved in turning on the parasympathetic nervous system. And Andrew Huberman as well, he's got a really good podcast on stress that I'd recommend listening to. I can't remember what number it is, but he doesn't have that many, so just scroll through until you find, I think it's stress and emotions. And he talks a lot about the physiological sigh, which is a double breath in, so it's a and then a. And so what this does is, it's part of that breath timing where it's exhale emphasized, but also the double inhale basically increases the air that are going into your alveoli, which are the little air sacs in your lungs. And a lot of them can be collapsed. And when you get the double inhale, like a full double inhale, then it opens them up, and then that obviously brings more oxygen into the system, but also releases more carbon dioxide when you get the exhale. And so they've found that is really good at mitigating the stress response and switching on parasympathetic nervous system activity. And I'll have to double check all of this, but remember in James, this just ticked for me, in James Nestor's book, Breath, he talks about how there's been studies where people are given carbon dioxide to inhale and they get feelings of extreme stress and anxiety and panic. And because it's essentially related to air hunger, so increased levels of carbon dioxide in your blood is the trigger for breathing. And if you've got heaps of carbon dioxide, it feels like you're like, I can't breathe. I need to breathe. And so it's that stress response. And so obviously if you get rid of that, if you reduce the amount of carbon dioxide, then that can help trigger that parasympathetic rest and digest response. So a good couple of sort of more physiological mechanisms rather than psychological, and that can be especially helpful in situations where you feel yourself being stressed, but you don't have time to go and meditate or go and journal some gratitude, or you don't have time to go and connect with humans. You've just got this stressful response and you want to mitigate it. Then you do a number of those in a row, and physiologically that's going to have an effect.
More and more is becoming, it's quite popular these days, the whole breath movement. But it's something that my boss said to me when I was a journo, just as I was starting out, starting to do live crosses, and you're broadcasting to hundreds of thousands of people live, and you're just standing in front of a camera. Don't have 200,000 people standing in front of you. Your nerves get up, and I've done a lot of public speaking, but it's a different beast knowing that you've got 45 seconds to deliver the script or the story that you've practiced and memorized, but you only get one go at it. And
it's intense.
You've got the earpiece in your ear and you're hearing the director count down. Okay, 15 seconds left to go, 10 seconds left to go. Then you hear the newsreader start talking, and then you have to jump in as soon as they finish their throw to you and Mac Lion, what's going on. And the best trick that I got taught was to just take, and all it took was one deep breath, but just a big breath in and a big sigh out, and level the nerves. And it's a trick that I used, right through the career. And while it wasn't probably the perfect breath technique that I was using,
it did the job.
It did the job.
Yeah. And especially if you wrap a belief around, if I do this breath, it's going to help, then extra helps.
Exactly.
And so, there's always an interplay between physiological and psychological, but stuff works, especially if you believe it's going to work, it'll work.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you see a saber-toothed tiger, then don't try a big deep breath. Just run.
Unless you can breathe out real strong and blow it away.
worth a shot, maybe. It's another thing that I like in terms of practices is what Frank talks about in New Old Way in terms of the yin and yang arts. So the yang arts is that more aggressive, take control. Like we've talked about, a lot of it's to do with your perception of your capability. And so if you take control of the situation, say your stressor is you've got too many things to do. You could meditate all you like, but you're still going to have all those things to do. And so a yang art, or that sort of take control aspect is, all right, what do I need to do? Set it out in a to-do list or in Trello we've got now, which has really been really helpful, and start ticking it off, prioritizing, and just have a ruthless schedule of this is what I do, bang, 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 bang. And then that is going to relieve a lot more stress than just meditating or just gratitude journaling, because you needed to feel that control over the situation.
Yeah.
And, things like strength training or martial arts training or things like that could also be viewed as that yang art where, if you've got some combative training or you know how to handle yourself and you come across a situation that's potentially violent or something, then you don't get that, oh, what do I do? Then you can calmly handle it because you've been under stressful situations as well. And this comes into improving stress tolerance. So exposing yourself to discomfort, whether it's, hot or cold exposure or, not extreme, but just breath work of different kinds that really challenge your ability with breathing, and vigorous movement and combative training. All these things get you used to that stress response and how to remain calm under that stress response. So when I've done jiu-jitsu in the past, it's very interesting. When you first start jiu-jitsu, you start getting tossed around like a rag doll and you've got no idea what you're doing, and your body's like, and you're just using all of your strength and you're like, get off me. And like, even though they're not going to really hurt you, it's physiologically, it's like, this person could kill me if they wanted to. And it freaks you out. And then you get used to it and you keep exposing yourself to that, and then you learn how to be calm, you learn how to breathe in that situation, you learn how to sort of play the game and change the narrative and understand that they're not they're not actually killing you. It's just a game. And then now I've experienced myself when I roll with other new people, then I'm on the other side where I'm breathing fine, I'm having fun, I'm relaxed, generally, obviously a bit of tension, but can relax into it, and they're rigid, like, and so exposing yourself to that, it takes practice. That's probably more the muscle concept that we were talking about before, where it takes that training and graded exposure to discomfort, but that can increase your stress tolerance, so that things that used to be stressful now no longer are, because you've trained your body to be able to handle that level of stress. And then obviously having quality sleep and nutrition and recovery methods will help improve stress tolerance as well. So if you're underslept, you are eating poorly or not at all, and you don't have good recovery methods, the likelihood of you being able to tolerate a stressor is much less. And all you have to do is think about a time that you've been underslept, and how much easier you snap at someone, or you get irritable, or you shout at the person that cut you off in traffic or whatever. Of course. It's just, you just can't tolerate as much stress when you're underslept or underfed. And then I guess that would come into more of the yin arts. So sleeping well, making sure it's the rest and digest, it's the meditation, it's the gratitude, all of the things that we've talked about.
Of course.
I think something interesting to end on is just the concept of collective stress, which Frank talks about in New Old Way. And this is how stress is kind of contagious, with the stories that we tell in our society, and, the things that are in the media, and a lot of it is quite fear-inducing. And I guess COVID's an easy example of how fear can be induced in a public, even if the people inducing that fear believe they're just telling the truth, and everyone needs to know, and so on. But or even not talking about COVID, because it's probably a bit of a sensitive topic, but it just, the whole concept that we have all of this negative fear-inducing news that's happening about the climate, or about the economy, or about the extinction, or whatever, or Trump, then it can really spread, and people, oh, did you hear about this? And like, it's this collective stress that builds and builds and builds, and a lot of it is to do with stories, and I guess you've experienced that a lot, and we've talked about that in the Power of Story podcast. But the other, I guess, a good thing to also remember is, yes, stress is contagious, but the opposite is also contagious. So, that if you're I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good word, but I just think of like a chill presence, like relaxed, chill, grateful, and present person, then that can actually be contagious as well. Yeah. So I guess my point there is just not to underestimate the effect that you can have on the people around you through changing your own narrative as well. And I've noticed that as a lot, I guess, even just, with you and I, and with other people in my life, where if you don't get stressed about something, then someone goes, oh yeah, maybe I don't need to stress about that. Or if someone is stressing about something and you stress about it as well, then it sort of feed each other, and then vice versa. And so I think that was why we did so well with that situation in Sydney with the COVID situation. We were both like, right. Actually, it's all right.
It's all right. And everyone's asking, are you sure? Like,
yeah, oh man, that really sucks. And we're like, oh no, we didn't think it sucked.
Yeah.
And so, again, this comes back to what we talked about with tribe, is just putting yourself around people who are more of that presence, or if you sense that, more relaxed and present style of being, and spending more time around those people can be a good way for that to rub off on you, and vice versa.
And I was going to say, I guess, it's probably also important for people to spread the word about stress, and explain to people that a lot of it is down to perception, because while stress itself is contagious, I feel like the belief that stress is really, really bad for you has spread pretty
Yeah,
widely
big
as
time.
well. And
Yeah.
so if we can spread the narrative that all hope isn't lost if you're if you're in a stressful place, then I think that too can go part of the way to flipping the script.
And a good thing is to link people resources like that TED Talk. It's like a 12-minute TED Talk and really punchy and powerful, and it's coming
Really,
from
really good.
someone
One
who's
of the
done
best
their
I watched.
research. And that one's called we can link in the show notes, but it's called How to Make Stress Your Friend by Kelly McGonigal, like Professor McGonigal. I don't know if she's a professor, but that would be pretty great. And yeah, she's got a book, and so linking people resources, and you gotta be sensitive to people's stress. You can't just say, oh, it's all in your head, and you gotta believe it's not bad for you. But if you say, oh, I heard this really interesting podcast, for example, on stress. If you liked this podcast or if you resonated with it, then maybe you can share this with them.
Yeah, go for it.
And that's our exit music going off prematurely, but that might be a sign that it's
a good call to end it up there.
A good sign to wrap up. So thanks for listening, guys. I hope you got something out of this podcast, and we'll catch you next week.
Cheers, guys.